Rebecca Whittaker fell to her knees in the dust before the man had even said a word, clutching her youngest daughter against her chest like the child might be ripped away. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking. "Don't send us back. I'll work the fields. I'll scrub your floors raw. Just don't make my babies sleep in that station house again." The cowboy crouched down to her level, removed his hat, and said the words that would change everything. If you believe every family deserves a chance, hit subscribe and stay with me to the very end, and drop the name of your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach wheel cracked against a rock outside Cedar Ridge, and that was the first sign God wasn't finished testing Rebecca Whittaker. She felt the jolt before she heard the driver curse, and her arms went instinctively around Annie, pressing the 4-year-old's face into her shoulder so the child wouldn't see the panic on her mother's. Lily grabbed the bench with both hands. Thomas, 7 and too curious for his own good, leaned toward the window, despite his mother's sharp whisper to sit still. "We're almost there," Rebecca said, though she didn't know if she said it for the children or for herself. The driver climbed down, swore again, and announced that the wheel needed mending an hour, maybe 2. Rebecca closed her eyes. An hour she didn't have. 2 hours felt like a sentence. She'd written to Samuel Boone 3 weeks prior, and the letter she'd sent had not mentioned 3 children. It had mentioned a widow seeking a fresh start. It had not mentioned Lily's nightmares, Thomas's endless questions about his dead father, or the way Annie still couldn't sleep without her torn rag doll pressed to her chest. Rebecca had lied by omission, and now the lie was about to arrive in the flesh, an hour late, covered in trail dust, in front of a man who'd agreed to marry a woman, not adopt a household. "Mama," Thomas said, "why are we stopped?" "The wheel broke, baby. We'll be moving soon." "Is the cowboy gonna be mad?" Rebecca didn't answer that. She didn't trust her own voice. When the wheel was finally mended and the stagecoach rolled into Cedar Ridge, the sun was already low, throwing long shadows across the dirt street. Rebecca saw him before he saw her. A tall man standing near the platform, hat in his hands. The kind of stillness that came from a man used to waiting on weather and cattle, and whatever else the land decided to do. Samuel Boone. She'd seen one photograph. The man in front of her was broader than the photograph suggested, sun-worn in a way that paper couldn't capture, with the kind of face that looked like it didn't smile often, but might mean it when it did. The stagecoach stopped. Rebecca's stomach dropped to somewhere near her boots. "Mama, is that him?" Lily whispered. "Yes. Does he know about us?" Rebecca closed her eyes for one breath. "Stay close to me, all of you." She stepped down first, smoothing her skirt with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, and then she turned to help Annie down, and then Thomas, and then Lily climbed down on her own with the particular pride of a 10-year-old who didn't want to be treated like a baby in front of strangers. Samuel's eyes moved from Rebecca to the children. 1, 2, 3. Rebecca watched his face for the flinch. She'd seen that flinch before from her own family back in Missouri, from neighbors who offered sympathy with one hand and distance with the other, from the minister who'd suggested gently that perhaps the children would be better placed with relatives so she could start fresh. She braced for it now. "Mr. Boone," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I should have written more in my letter. I have 3 children, Lily, Thomas, and Annie. If that's more than you bargained for, I understand. We can find lodging in town and—" "Ma'am." He said it quiet, but it stopped her cold. "You're standing in the dust apologizing for your own children," Samuel said. "Don't reckon that's a habit I'd let continue if you're fixing to stay." Rebecca blinked. "I beg your pardon? I said I wrote for a wife." He looked at the children again, longer this time, like he was actually seeing them instead of counting them. Didn't say anything about not wanting a family to go with her. Lily's hand found Rebecca's skirt and gripped it. "You don't have to say that to be polite," Rebecca said. "I won't hold you to a kindness you don't mean." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, not quite a smile, but close enough that Rebecca felt her chest tighten. "Wasn't being polite," he said. "Been polite to plenty of folks I didn't mean a word to. This ain't that." Thomas, who had been silent the whole exchange, suddenly blurted, "Do you have horses?" "Thomas," Rebecca hissed. But Samuel crouched down to the boy's level, the way a man does when he respects a question enough to answer it properly. "Got 6. One of 'em's a mare who just dropped a foal 3 weeks back." Thomas's eyes went wide as saucers. "Can I see it?" "Thomas, that's enough. Reckon you can see it tomorrow, if your mother allows it," Samuel said, standing back up, eyes flicking to Rebecca for permission in a way that surprised her. Most men didn't ask. Most men decided. Rebecca didn't know what to do with a man who asked. "We'll see," she said, because it was the only thing she could manage. Calvin Rusk chose that exact moment to walk past the platform, slow and deliberate, the way a man walks when he wants to be noticed walking. He was older than Samuel, dressed finer than anyone had a right to be in a town built on cattle and dust. And his eyes moved over Rebecca and the children with an expression she recognized instantly, the same expression the minister back home had worn. Calculation dressed up as concern. "Boone," Calvin said, tipping his hat without an ounce of warmth in the gesture. "This the woman then, Rusk." Samuel's voice didn't change, but something in his shoulders did a kind of bracing. Calvin's gaze settled on the children. "Didn't realize you were getting a whole brood along with the bride. That's generous of you." "Wasn't looking for credit," Samuel said. No, of course not." Calvin smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "Just surprised is all. Man takes on 3 children that aren't his well. That's a lot of mouths, a lot of expense. Hope the letter mentioned that part clear, ma'am, before you set your hopes on a husband." Rebecca felt heat rise in her face. Not embarrassment, but something closer to fury, banked low and old. The kind that came from being talked about like she wasn't standing right there. "My children aren't an expense, Mr. Rusk," she said. "They're the reason I get up every morning." Calvin's smile flickered just slightly, like he hadn't expected the widow to have a spine. "Didn't mean any offense." "Then maybe don't speak about them like furniture being delivered," Samuel said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that made Calvin's jaw tighten. For a moment, the 2 men just looked at each other, and Rebecca understood, without anyone explaining it, that there was history there. Old, ugly, unresolved history that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with whatever land lay between Samuel's ranch and Calvin's ambitions. Calvin tipped his hat again, slower this time, eyes lingering on Rebecca a beat too long. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge, ma'am. Hope you find it accommodating." He walked off before anyone could answer. Annie, who had been silent and clinging this whole time, finally lifted her head from Rebecca's shoulder. "Mama, who was that man?" "Nobody important, baby." But Samuel was watching Calvin's retreating back with an expression that suggested he disagreed. "Don't mind him," Samuel said, turning back to the family. "Calvin Rusk's been wanting my land since before I built on it. He'll find a way to make trouble out of a Sunday morning if it serves him." "Why does he want your land?" Lily asked. Surprising Rebecca, the girl rarely spoke to strangers. "Water rights," Samuel said simply. "My creek runs through to his property line. Man's been trying to buy me out for 2 years." "You won't sell?" Rebecca asked. "No, ma'am." Something flickered across his face. "Land was my pa's. Before that, his pa's. Selling it'd be like selling the only proof we were ever here at all." Rebecca understood that kind of grief better than she wanted to. The wagon ride to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and Rebecca spent most of it watching Samuel from the corner of her eye, trying to read him the way she'd learned to read men for the cracks. For the moment, the kindness would slip and show what was underneath. It didn't slip. He answered Thomas's endless stream of questions about horses and cattle, and how many acres a man needed to call himself a rancher. He didn't flinch when Annie, overtired, began to cry softly, and he didn't suggest Rebecca quiet her faster. He simply kept the wagon steady and let the child cry herself out against her mother's shoulder. When they finally crested the hill and the ranch house came into view, larger than Rebecca had expected, 2 stories with a wraparound porch smoke curling from the chimney where someone had clearly banked a fire in anticipation of their arrival, Lily was the one who spoke. "Is that all yours?" "Ours, if your mother says yes to me proper," Samuel said. Mine for now. Rebecca's throat tightened. She hadn't said yes to anything yet. There had been no proper proposal, no courtship, nothing but letters exchanged across half a country, and a desperate widow's decision that anything was better than watching her children go hungry in Missouri. But standing there looking at the house and the man beside her, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in over a year. Hope and the terror that came with it. They unloaded what little they'd brought, 2 trunks no more. Everything else sold or left behind, and Samuel carried both without being asked, refusing Rebecca's offer to help with a simple shake of his head. You've carried enough, he said. Let me carry something for once. Rebecca didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all. Inside the house was clean but sparse. A man's house built for function rather than comfort, with none of the small touches Rebecca associated with a home that had known a woman's care. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs, Samuel explained, though only 2 had furniture in them yet. I'll get beds for the children this week, he said. Didn't want to presume on numbers before I knew for certain. You knew I had children, Rebecca said. My letter said as much, even if it didn't say how many. Said a child, Samuel corrected gently. Singular. Figured maybe you'd round down out of modesty, but 3's a fair bit more than I was picturing. Rebecca's stomach dropped again. If you want to reconsider. Didn't say that. He set the trunks down at the base of the stairs. Said it was more than I pictured. Didn't say it was unwelcome. Why? The word came out before she could stop it sharper than she intended. Why would you want this a woman with 3 children who isn't yours, in a county where a man like Calvin Rusk will use it against you every chance he gets? Why would any sane man choose that? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Rebecca thought he might not answer at all. Had a brother, he finally said. Younger than me by 6 years. Fever took him when he was 9. Took my ma the winter after, and my pa just sort of stopped after that. Lived another 4 years but wasn't really living, just existing in the same house as me, waiting for his own turn. Rebecca didn't move, didn't breathe. This house has had a lot of silence in it, Samuel continued. Built it big because I figured I'd fill it someday, wife, children, the whole noisy mess of a family. Instead, I've spent 6 years rattling around in rooms that don't need filling, listening to wind instead of voices. He looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression that Rebecca recognized because she carried the same thing. You're not asking me to take on a burden, ma'am. You're offering to fill a house that's been empty too long. I'd be a fool to turn that down because the number was higher than I expected. Lily, who had been listening from the staircase where she thought no one noticed her, spoke up. What if we're too much trouble? Samuel turned to her, and his voice gentled in a way that made Rebecca's chest ache. Miss Lily, I've mended fences in a blizzard, pulled calves in the middle of the night, and buried half my family by the time I was 16. Reckon I know trouble when I see it. 3 tired children who've traveled 1,000 miles, ain't it? Lily didn't smile, but she didn't look away either, which, from a girl as guarded as Lily, was practically an embrace. That night, after the children were settled, Thomas and Annie sharing the one furnished room, Lily insisting on a pallet near her mother's door, rather than a room of her own. Rebecca found herself standing on the porch, unable to sleep, despite the exhaustion in her bones. Samuel was there too, leaning against the porch rail, looking out at the dark shapes of the cattle in the distance. Couldn't sleep either, he said, not quite a question. No. Rebecca wrapped her shawl tighter. I keep waiting for the part where this goes wrong. Might take a while, Samuel said. I'm a patient man. Calvin Rusk didn't seem patient. Something hardened in Samuel's jaw. Calvin Rusk's been trying to push me off my own land for 2 years. Used every trick a man with money and no conscience can think of. Don't reckon he'll stop just because I've got a family now. Might even get worse. Then why bring us into it? Rebecca asked. Why give him more reasons to come after you? Samuel turned to look at her directly, and in the moonlight, his face looked older, more tired, more honest than it had all day. Ma'am, I've spent 6 years being a target for that man with nothing to lose but land. Land's just dirt. I can lose dirt and still wake up the next morning. His voice dropped lower. but I haven't had anything worth fighting for in a long while. Maybe it's selfish, but I'd rather have something worth losing than keep on having nothing worth keeping." Rebecca felt the words land somewhere deep. Somewhere she'd kept locked since her husband's death, since the long year of watching doors close in her face, because a widow with 3 children was a liability and not a person. "My husband died owing money," she said quietly, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. "Land speculation. Lost everything, the house, the savings, even most of the furniture. I spent a year watching people who used to call themselves friends cross the street so they wouldn't have to look at me. The minister suggested I give the children to relatives so I could start fresh, as if they were debts to be settled instead of my own flesh and blood." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd rather starve beside my children than eat well without them." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, not pity, which Rebecca had learned to hate, but recognition, respect. "That's the kind of woman worth a man riding into trouble for," he said. Rebecca's eyes burned, and she looked away before he could see the tears threatening to fall. "You don't know me well enough to say that. Don't need years to know character, ma'am. Knew it the moment you knelt in the dust apologizing for children who deserve no apology from anyone, least of all their own mother." His voice was steady, certain. "Took courage to travel 1,000 miles on a stranger's word. Takes more courage to keep fighting for 3 children when the whole world's telling you to set the fight down. I see that. Calvin Rusk can talk all he wants. Don't change what I see standing in front of me." Rebecca didn't have words for that. She simply stood beside him in the dark, listening to the distant lowing of cattle, feeling something in her chest loosen for the first time in over a year. It wasn't trust yet. Trust would take longer than one evening. One kind speech, one man who hadn't yet shown her the version of himself that would eventually disappoint her, because in Rebecca's experience that version always arrived eventually. But it was something. A crack of light where there had only been the closed door of grief and fear. "Thank you," she finally said, "for not making us feel like a burden tonight." "Wasn't hard," Samuel said. "Don't reckon it'll get hard tomorrow either, or the day after." Rebecca wanted to believe him. She didn't yet. But she wanted to. And somewhere in the dark, Calvin Rusk sat in his study with a lamp burning late, already drafting the first of many letters that would arrive in Cedar Ridge in the weeks to come. Letters designed to remind the whole town that Samuel Boone had taken in another man's leftover family, and that a man who couldn't say no to a desperate widow was a man who couldn't be trusted to hold on to his land either. The fight for Rebecca's family had only just begun. Neither she nor Samuel yet understood how far Calvin Rusk was willing to go to win it. The sun hadn't fully risen when Rebecca woke to silence so complete it frightened her more than noise would have. She bolted upright on her pallet, heart hammering before she remembered where she was. Not Missouri. Not the boarding house with its thin walls and Thomas's nightmares bleeding through. Cedar Ridge. Samuel Boone's house. She heard Annie's small voice through the wall, asking Lily where Mama was, and Rebecca was on her feet, and moving before Lily even answered. She found them in the kitchen. Samuel stood at the stove, flipping flapjacks with the careful concentration of a man who'd taught himself to cook out of necessity rather than skill, while Thomas sat at the table peppering him with questions about the foal. "Mama?" Annie ran to her cloth doll dangling from one hand. "The cowboy made breakfast." Rebecca's eyes went to Samuel, who didn't look up from the stove. "Didn't want to wake you. Figured you'd had enough waking up to strange houses for one trip. You didn't have to do this." "Didn't have to. Wanted to." He slid a flapjack onto Thomas's plate. "Eat up, all of you. Lily, there's coffee if you want it, though I suspect you're more a milk drinker at 10. Lily, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, didn't move. "I can make my own breakfast. Don't need you doing it." "Lily!" Rebecca's voice carried warning. "It's fine," Samuel said, setting the pan down. "Girl's got every right to be careful. Wouldn't trust a stranger handing me food, either, not after the year she's had." He looked at Lily directly. "You don't have to eat what I made. There's bread in the pantry if you'd rather fix your own." Lily blinked, clearly thrown by a man who didn't push. "I'll eat it," she finally muttered, sliding into a chair. "Don't mean I trust you yet. Didn't ask you to," Samuel said, and went back to the stove like the exchange hadn't cost him anything. Though Rebecca saw the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested it had. By mid-morning, Rebecca had made herself useful the only way she knew how, scrubbing the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, beating dust from curtains that had clearly not seen a woman's attention in years, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spinning toward all the ways this arrangement could collapse. She found Samuel in the barn an hour later, teaching Thomas how to approach the new foal without spooking the mare. "Slow," Samuel was saying, crouched beside the boy. "Horses know fear before they know kindness. You walk in there scared, she'll feel it before you say a word." Thomas, trembling with excitement rather than fear, inched forward exactly as instructed. The mare's ears flicked, but she didn't startle. "Mr. Boone, you don't have to teach him that," Rebecca said from the doorway. "He'll wear out his welcome asking too many questions. Boy asks questions 'cause he's curious, not because he's trying to be a bother." Samuel didn't look back at her. "World's got enough folks telling children to be quiet. Don't reckon I need to add to that number." "I just don't want you feeling obligated to entertain him." Samuel finally turned, and there was something almost stern in his expression. "Ma'am, with respect, I don't do things I don't want to do. Never have. If I'm out here with your boy, it's because I want to be, not because I feel some debt to pay off." Rebecca didn't have a response for that. She was still learning the shape of a man who said exactly what he meant and meant exactly what he said. The reprieve didn't last. 3 days later, Rebecca walked into town for supplies and felt it the moment she stepped onto the main street. The particular weight of being watched, whispered about, weighed and measured by people who'd already decided her worth before she'd said a single word. Mrs. Caldwell, who ran the dry goods store, gave her a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're the widow staying out at the Boone place." "I am." Rebecca kept her chin level. "Rebecca Whitaker. Heard you brought quite a few children with you." "3, yes." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes flicked toward the door, where Lily stood holding Annie's hand, both girls trying to look anywhere but at the woman discussing them like livestock at auction. "Must be a relief finding a man willing to take on that kind of responsibility. Not many would." "Samuel Boone isn't taking on a responsibility." Rebecca said, her voice sharper than she intended. "He's building a family." Of course. Mrs. Caldwell's smile thinned further. "Though I did hear Calvin Rusk mention it might be more charity than courtship. Said Boone's always been soft-hearted, even when it costs him." Rebecca's hands curled at her sides. "Mr. Rusk seems to have a great deal to say about a man's private affairs." "Calvin Rusk has a great deal to say about everything, dear. Comes with owning half the county." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite malice, but wasn't kindness either. "Just thought you should know what folks are saying. Better to hear it from a friendly face than have it whispered behind your back." Rebecca paid for her supplies and left without another word, her face burning her chest tight with the particular humiliation of being discussed and pitied in the same breath. Outside, Lily was waiting with her arms crossed, the posture of a girl who'd heard every word through the open door. "They talk about us like we're a problem someone has to solve," Lily said. "Don't listen to them." "How am I supposed to not listen when they say it loud enough for the whole street to hear?" Rebecca had no answer for that. She took Annie's free hand and walked them back toward the wagon, every step feeling heavier than the last. That night, after the children were in bed, Rebecca found Samuel mending a fence post by lantern light, even though the work could have waited for morning. She suspected he was out there because the house felt too quiet, too full of unspoken things, the same reason she couldn't sleep. "Town's talking," she said without preamble. Samuel didn't look up from the post. "Town always talks, especially when Calvin Rusk gives them something to chew on. They're saying you're being charitable, that you're soft-hearted for taking on a widow with 3 children like we're some kind of project you've taken pity on." Her voice cracked slightly. "I didn't come here to be your charity, Samuel." He set down his hammer and finally looked at her, and there was something fierce in his expression that she hadn't seen before. "Then don't be. Don't let Calvin Rusk's poison decide what this is. I know what I asked for in my letters. I know what I meant by it. Town gossip doesn't change a single word of that. It changes how you're seen, how you're treated. Calvin already wants your land, you said so yourself. Now he's got a weapon to use against you, and it's me. It's my children. Let him try. Samuel's jaw set hard. Man's been trying to break me for 2 years over water rights. He thinks adding a family to the mix gives him more leverage. He's about to learn different. And if it cost you everything, the land you're standing in this town, everything your father built. Samuel stepped closer, close enough that Rebecca had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. Ma'am, I told you the first night land's just dirt. I can rebuild dirt. What I can't rebuild is the chance I've got right now sitting in my house, sleeping under my roof, slowly starting to trust that maybe not every man's going to disappoint them. His voice dropped lower. I'm not letting Calvin Rusk's gossip undo that. Not for water rights, not for standing in town, not for anything. Rebecca felt tears threatening and hated herself for it. You don't know what you're promising. I know exactly what I'm promising. He held her gaze steady. I've buried my whole family one at a time, ma'am. Learned the hard way that the things worth fighting for are rare enough you don't let go once you've got hold of them. She turned away before he could see her cry, but she heard him pick the hammer back up, heard the steady rhythm of him finishing the fence post in the dark. A man choosing to work rather than walk away from a conversation that had clearly cost him something to have. The following week brought a kind of fragile rhythm to the house. Not peace, exactly, but something close enough to mistake for it in low light. Thomas grew bolder around the horses, graduating from watching to brushing the mare under Samuel's supervision. Annie's fever of shyness toward Samuel began to break the 4-year-old, taking to following him around the yard with the devotion of a duckling that had imprinted on the wrong species. It was Annie's doll that became the unexpected bridge. The cloth doll stitched by Rebecca's own mother years before her death, before any of this grief had started, had been Annie's constant companion since her father's funeral, the one object the child refused to be parted from, even for bathing. Rebecca had mended it twice already, the fabric thinning, the stitches straining. On a hot afternoon in late June, with the kind of heat that made the whole ranch shimmer at the edges. Annie's doll caught on a fence nail and tore clean across the middle, stuffing spilling onto the dirt. Annie's wail was the kind that came from somewhere deeper than a torn toy, the kind that pulled grief from a child too young to name it properly. Mama, fix her, please fix her. Rebecca's hands were elbow-deep in laundry, and her own hands shook too badly with sudden panic to thread a needle steady. Lily tried and couldn't manage the small stitches needed. Thomas hovered useless, unable to do anything but watch his sister sob. It was Samuel who came in from the barn, drawn by the crying, and who took one look at the situation and held out his hand. Let me try. You don't know how to sew, Rebecca said, half laughing despite the tension, despite Annie's continued wailing. No, ma'am, but I know how to mend a torn saddle blanket, and a doll can't be that different. He sat down at the table, pulled out a leather working needle from his pocket, the kind meant for tack, not fabric, and threaded it with whatever thin cord he had on hand. His stitches were clumsy, thick, uneven, the kind of work that would have embarrassed any seamstress, but he worked with a patience that silenced the room. Annie's crying slowing to hiccups as she watched the big rancher hunched over her small doll with a furrow of concentration between his brows. When he finished, the doll's torso was held together by stitches that looked more like fence repair than needlework, but it was whole again. There, Samuel said, handing it back. Ugliest mending you'll ever see, but she'll hold. Annie took the doll, examined the stitches with the serious scrutiny only a 4-year-old could manage, and then hugged it to her chest with a fierceness that made Rebecca's throat tighten. I like the stitches, Annie announced. They look strong. That they are, Samuel said. Rebecca watched this exchange with something cracking open in her chest. Not trust yet, not fully, but the beginning of it, the first real fracture in the wall she'd built since her husband's death. That fracture widened further 3 days later, when Lily guarded watchful Lily, who had spoken to Samuel only when necessary, since their arrival, finally let her guard slip. It happened over something small. Samuel had been repairing the chicken coop, and Lily had been watching from a distance the way she always watched, assessing, judging, waiting for the cruelty she'd learned to expect from men who claimed to want her family. "You're doing that wrong," she said suddenly. Samuel looked up surprised. "Beg pardon." "The hinge. You're putting the screw in crooked. It'll work loose in a month." Samuel studied the hinge, then looked back at her with something like respect. "You know carpentry." "My pa taught me, before he died." Her voice was flat-guarded, but she'd offered the information freely, which was more than she'd given Samuel in 2 weeks. He said a girl should know how to fix things, not just wait around for a man to do it. "Smart man." Samuel held out the screwdriver. "Show me then." Lily hesitated, clearly unprepared for the offer, and then crossed the yard and took the tool from his hand. She worked silently, efficiently, correcting his mistake with the kind of competence that suggested her father had taught her more than just carpentry. "There," she said when she finished. "That'll hold." "Much obliged," Samuel said, and didn't make a fuss of it, didn't praise her excessively, or treat the moment like more than it was, and Rebecca, watching from the porch, understood that this restraint was exactly why Lily had let her guard down in the first place. He wasn't performing kindness. He was simply being kind, without an audience, without expectation of credit. But peace in Cedar Ridge never lasted long, not with Calvin Rusk watching from his finer house on the finer side of town, calculating his next move. It came on a Sunday after church, when the whole town gathered outside the small white chapel for the kind of socializing that doubled as surveillance in towns this size. Rebecca had dressed the children carefully, wanting to present them well, wanting desperately for the town to see what she saw. Good children, tired and grieving, but fundamentally good, not the burden Calvin Rusk had painted them as. It didn't work the way she'd hoped. Calvin approached with his usual smile, the one that never reached his eyes. Trailed by 2 men, Rebecca didn't recognize ranch hands by the look of their clothes, though something about their posture suggested muscle rather than labor. "Mrs. Whitaker." Calvin tipped his hat. "Settling in well, I trust." "Quite well, thank you. Glad to hear it." His eyes moved to the children, lingering on Thomas in particular. "Heard young Thomas has taken a shine to Boone's horses. Spending a lot of time in that barn, I understand." "He's a careful boy. Samuel's been teaching him well." "I'm sure." Calvin's smile widened slightly. "Funny thing about barns, though. Dangerous places for children who don't know what they're doing. Horses spook easy. Equipment's sharp. Man really ought to be careful letting a child that age run loose around livestock." Rebecca felt the threat beneath the words even before she fully processed them. "Thomas is supervised at all times." Of course. Just making conversation, ma'am. Hate to see an accident happen to a sweet boy like that. Terrible thing losing a child to carelessness." Calvin's eyes flicked toward Samuel, who had gone rigid several feet away, clearly having heard every word. "Though I suppose a man taking on 3 children that aren't his own might not know all the ins and outs of keeping them safe. Different thing raising your own blood versus someone else's." The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Samuel crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "You threatening my family, Rusk?" "Threatening?" Calvin's hand went to his chest in mock offense. "Heavens no. Just expressing concern, neighbor to neighbor. Surely you understand a man's worry for children in a household still finding its footing. The only thing unsteady about this household is the number of times you've tried to put your nose where it doesn't belong." Samuel's voice had dropped to something dangerous quiet in the way that promised more than shouting ever could. "You've got a problem with me, Rusk, you bring it to me direct. Leave the children out of it." "I've no problem with children, Boone. Just water rights and a man who won't see reason about selling land that's costing him more than it's worth." Calvin's smile sharpened. "Though I imagine a family that size costs a fair bit too. Feeding 3 extra mouths, clothing them, eventually schooling them. Man's expenses just tripled overnight. Hope your cattle prices hold steady this season." "My finances are my own business." "Course they are." Just hate to see a good man stretched thin, trying to play hero to a widow he barely knows. Calvin's gaze swept to Rebecca one final time. No offense intended, Mrs. Whitaker. Just looking out for my neighbor's well-being. He walked away with his men trailing behind, leaving a silence in his wake that felt heavier than anything that had been said aloud. Lily's hand found Rebecca's sleeve, gripping tight. He's trying to scare us away. I know, baby. Is it working? Rebecca looked at Samuel, who stood with his jaw clenched, watching Calvin's retreating back with an intensity that suggested the fight between them was far from over. No, Rebecca said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. It's not. That evening, the tension from the church confrontation hadn't fully dissipated by the time the children were settled for bed. Rebecca found Samuel in the study, a small room she'd rarely entered hunched over a stack of papers by lamplight. What are those water rights documents? Land deeds? He didn't look up. Calvin's been threatening lawsuits for 2 years, claiming the original survey was wrong, that my creek access infringes on his property line. Lawyer in town's looked it over twice, says my claim's solid, but Calvin's got money for appeals I don't have for defense. He could actually take your land. Could try. Courts in this territory aren't always fair to the man with less money in his pocket even when the law's on his side. Samuel finally looked up, and the exhaustion in his face was new, raw. Today wasn't an accident, ma'am. Calvin's escalating because he sees an opportunity, sees a family he thinks makes me vulnerable, makes me a target for gossip and pressure he didn't have before you arrived. Rebecca's stomach twisted with guilt. Then maybe we should leave. Find lodging in town, take the pressure off you until... No. The word came out sharp, immediate. No, ma'am, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying Calvin's a snake, and snakes strike where they sense weakness. I won't let him mistake kindness for weakness. Won't let him chase off the first real family I've had a chance at in years. But if it costs you the land, then it costs me the land. Samuel stood, came around the desk, stopped close enough that Rebecca had to look up to meet his eyes. I told you before, land's dirt. What you and your children have given this house in 2 weeks is worth more than every acre Calvin Rusk is fighting over. You barely know us. Know enough. His voice softened. No, Thomas asks 100 questions a day because his mind never stops working, and that he's gentle with the horses in a way that tells me he's gentle by nature, not just taught manners. No. Lily corrects my carpentry because she's smart enough to see what's wrong and brave enough to say so even to a man she doesn't trust yet. No, Annie hums while she plays this little tune under her breath, like even after everything she's lost, she's still got music left in her. His eyes held Rebecca's. And I know you knelt in the dust the first day apologizing for children who are the best thing about you, because somewhere along the way, people convinced you that loving them fiercely made you a burden instead of a mother worth admiring. Rebecca's breath caught. Samuel. I'm not finished. His voice was quiet but firm. Calvin Rusk can threaten land lawsuits, gossip, whatever weapon he's got left in that ugly arsenal of his. None of it changes what I see when I look at this family. None of it makes me regret a single letter I wrote asking you to come. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The lamplight flickered between them, casting long shadows across the small room, and Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest. Not full trust, not yet, but a crack wide enough that hope was beginning to seep through, despite every instinct telling her to brace for disappointment. I don't know how to do this, she finally admitted. I don't know how to let myself believe someone won't eventually decide we're too much trouble. Then don't believe it yet, Samuel said. Just stay long enough to find out. The next morning brought a different kind of trouble, one that arrived not through gossip or threats, but through the simple terror of a child's body betraying her without warning. Annie woke flushed and listless, her usual chatter replaced by a worrying quiet that Rebecca recognized immediately as wrong. By mid-morning, the child's forehead burned hot enough that Rebecca's hands shook checking it. She's got fever, Rebecca said, fighting to keep panic from her voice. Started sudden, too sudden. Samuel was beside her, instantly pressing his own hand to Annie's forehead, his expression shifting from concern to something sharper, more focused. How high? I don't know. High. Higher than just teething or a cold. The summer heat outside made everything worse. The kind of brutal late June temperature that turned the whole house into an oven by midday. No relief in sight. Annie, normally too energetic to sit still for more than a few minutes, lay limp against Rebecca's chest, her breathing shallow and fast. "I'll get the doctor," Samuel said, already moving toward the door. "It's an hour ride, maybe more. Then I'd best leave now instead of standing here talking about it." He was already pulling on his boots, his movements quick and economical, a man who'd clearly faced emergencies before and knew the value of speed over panic. "Samuel," Rebecca's voice cracked. "If something happens to her while you're gone—" He stopped at the door, turned back, and the look on his face stole whatever else she'd been about to say. "Nothing's going to happen to her. You hear me? I'm going to bring that doctor back if I have to drag him by his collar. You just keep her cool, keep her drinking water if she'll take it, and don't you dare let yourself believe the worst before it's earned." He was gone before she could respond, the sound of his horse's hooves fading fast into the distance, leaving Rebecca alone with 3 frightened children, and a fever that seemed to climb by the hour. Lily appeared in the doorway, Thomas hovering behind her, both children's faces pale with fear. They were too old and too young respectively to hide. "Is Annie going to die?" Thomas asked, his voice small. "No," Rebecca said with more conviction than she felt memories of her husband's final fever rising unbidden the way it had taken him so fast, despite every prayer, every desperate effort. "No, baby, she's going to be fine." But even as she said it, soaking a cloth in cool water and pressing it to Annie's burning forehead, Rebecca felt the old terror clawing up from wherever she'd buried it after her husband's death. The terror of watching someone she loved slip away, despite everything she did to hold them here. Outside, the summer sun climbed higher, merciless and indifferent, while somewhere on the road to town, Samuel Boone rode harder than he'd ridden in years, praying to a God he wasn't always sure was listening, that he'd make it back in time. And in his finer house, on the finer side of town, Calvin Rusk received word of the fever, through one of his men, word that traveled fast in small towns. Word that gave him an idea so ugly it would have shamed any decent man. If Boone was distracted by a sick child that wasn't even his own blood, distracted enough to leave his ranch unguarded, distracted enough to be vulnerable in ways he hadn't been before, well, a patient man knew how to recognize opportunity when fever delivered it straight to his door. Annie's breathing turned shallow by mid-afternoon, and Rebecca had counted that breath 100 times in the last hour, the way she'd counted her husband's in his final days, terrified that this counting might end the same way. "Mama!" Lily stood in the doorway, a basin of fresh water in her hands, her voice carefully steady, in the way of a child trying hard to be brave for someone else's sake. "I changed the cloth." "Thank you, baby." Annie stirred against the pillow, eyes fluttering without fully opening lips, moving around words too soft to catch. "What's she saying?" Thomas asked from the corner, knees pulled to his chest, refusing to leave even though Rebecca had asked him twice to wait downstairs. Rebecca leaned closer. Annie's small voice, cracked with fever, repeated the same 2 words. "Papa! Papa!" The room went silent except for the wind outside. Rebecca's hands trembled as she pressed the cool cloth to her daughter's forehead. "Your papa's not here, sweetheart. But Mama's here. Mama's not leaving." "Where's the cowboy?" Annie mumbled, eyes still closed. "He went to get the doctor. He's coming back." "Promise?" Rebecca's throat closed. She'd made promises like this before to a husband burning with fever in a bed. Not unlike this one, and the promise hadn't mattered against what the fever wanted to take. "I promise," she said anyway, because what else was there to say to a frightened child? Outside, the heat had turned the whole afternoon into something hostile, the kind of summer day that punished everything living. Samuel had been gone almost 2 hours now, too long for an hour's ride, and Rebecca's mind kept circling back to all the ways a man could be delayed on these roads. A lamed horse. A washed-out crossing. Calvin Rusk's men. She pushed the thought away, but it returned anyway, insistent ugly. On the road, Samuel was discovering exactly how right her fear had been. He'd made good time for the first half hour, pushing his horse harder than was wise in the heat. But as the trail narrowed near the creek crossing, the same creek, Calvin Rusk had spent 2 years trying to claim 2 riders emerged from the tree line and blocked his path. Samuel recognized them immediately. Rusk's men. The same 2 who'd flanked Calvin at church. "Evening, Boone." The taller one, a man named Pruitt, didn't bother with pleasantries. "Heard you're in a hurry." "Got a sick child, needs a doctor. Move." "Funny thing about hurry." Pruitt said, his horse sidestepping to block the trail more fully. "Mr. Rusk's been wanting a word about that creek crossing. Says it sits on disputed land. Maybe you oughtn't be riding through it without proper permission." "This crossing's been mine since before you were old enough to sit a horse," Samuel said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. "I don't have time for whatever game Rusk's playing today. There's a 4-year-old back at my house burning up with fever, and every minute you waste me here is a minute closer to losing her." Something flickered in Pruitt's expression, not quite guilt, but close enough that Samuel pressed the advantage. "You got children, Pruitt, nieces, nephews, anybody you'd ride through hell for." "That ain't the point." "It's exactly the point." Samuel's horse stamped beneath him, picking up on its rider's barely contained fury. "Rusk sent you out here to delay me while a child might be dying. You want to be the man who carries that on his conscience, you go right ahead and keep blocking this trail. Otherwise, move." The second rider, younger, clearly less committed to the confrontation, shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Pruitt, maybe we ought to—" "Quiet." Pruitt's jaw worked, weighing orders against whatever conscience he had left. Finally, he spat to the side and pulled his horse back a half step. "This ain't settled, Boone. Rusk's gonna hear about this." "Rusk can hear whatever he wants. Right now, I've got a child to save." Samuel didn't wait for further argument. He spurred his horse forward, forcing the gap between the 2 riders, and didn't look back even as Pruitt shouted something after him that the wind swallowed before it reached his ears. He made it to town 20 minutes later, lathered horse and lathered rider both, and didn't bother dismounting properly before he was pounding on Dr. Hale's door. Doc, I need you now." The door opened to reveal an older man, gray-bearded, already reaching for his coat at the urgency in Samuel's voice. "Boone." "What's happened?" "Fever. Bad one. 4-year-old girl came on sudden, breathing's gone shallow." Samuel was already turning back toward the horses. "Please, Doc. I can't lose her." Something in the way he said it. I can't lose her. Not she can't be lost, the possessive claiming a child, not his own blood, with the fierce instinct of a man already devoted, made the doctor move faster. "Get my bag. We'll take my buggy faster than 2 horses fighting the same trail." They made the return trip in considerably less time than Samuel's outward ride, though every minute still felt like an eternity to a man whose mind kept circling back to a small girl's fevered face and a torn doll mended with thick, clumsy stitches. Back at the ranch, Rebecca had moved through every remedy she knew. Cool cloths, small sips of water, the lavender oil she'd carried across 1,000 miles for exactly this kind of emergency, and none of it seemed to be enough. Annie's fever hadn't broken. If anything, it had climbed. "Mama, she's shaking," Lily said, her voice rising toward panic despite her best efforts. Rebecca pulled Annie closer, feeling the small body tremble against her own. And for one terrible moment, she was back in that other room, that other summer, watching her husband's body do the exact same thing in the hours before he died. "No," she whispered, furious, refusing the memory permission to repeat itself. "Not her. Not my baby. You don't get her too." The sound of wheels on the dirt drive nearly stopped her heart with relief. Samuel was through the door before the buggy had fully stopped Dr. Hale right behind him, and the next several minutes blurred into the kind of controlled chaos that comes when help finally arrives after hours of helpless waiting. "How long has she had the fever?" Dr. Hale asked, already examining Annie with practiced hands. "Since this morning. Came on fast." "Any rash vomiting?" No rash. She was sick to her stomach once an hour ago. The doctor's hands moved efficiently, checking Annie's pulse, her breathing the heat radiating from her small body. Rebecca watched every flicker of his expression, searching for the verdict before he spoke it. It's a summer fever, aggressive, but not unusual for this heat, Dr. Hale finally said. Her body's fighting hard. We need to bring the fever down, keep her hydrated, and watch her closely through the night. If it breaks by morning, she'll likely recover fully. And if it doesn't break? Rebecca asked, voice barely above a whisper. The doctor's hesitation answered the question more clearly than words would have. Let's focus on what we can do right now, he said instead. I'll show you both how to manage the fever properly. The next several hours passed in a haze of cool baths, careful spoonfuls of water, and the kind of vigilant watching that hollows out a person from the inside. Dr. Hale stayed until well past dark, finally leaving with instructions and a promise to return at first light. But the moment his buggy pulled away, the full weight of the waiting settled back onto Rebecca's shoulders. You should sleep, Samuel said, finding her still sitting beside Annie's bed near midnight. Lily and Thomas, finally asleep in the next room, after Rebecca had insisted. I can't. Then let me sit with her while you rest, even an hour. I can't, Samuel. Her voice cracked on his name. If I close my eyes and something happens, I'll never forgive myself for not being here. Samuel didn't argue further. Instead, he pulled a second chair beside hers and sat down, settling in for what was clearly going to be a long night, and Rebecca found she didn't have the strength left to tell him to go to bed himself. They sat together in silence for a long while, the only sounds Annie's labored breathing and the occasional creak of the house settling around them. Tell me about your brother, Rebecca finally said. The one who died of fever. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. His name was Daniel. 9 years old, full of more energy than the whole ranch could hold. Used to follow me everywhere, asking the same 100 questions Thomas asks now. His voice roughened. Fever took him in 3 days. I was 13, old enough to understand what was happening, too young to do anything to stop it. Sat right here, same as this, watching him get smaller and smaller until he stopped, the unfinished sentence heavier than any ending could have been. I'm sorry, Rebecca said. Been a long time. Don't usually talk about it. He looked at her, something raw and honest in his expression. But I understand what you're feeling right now better than most folks could. That terror that you're about to watch it happen again, helpless to stop it twice. Is that why you rode so hard? Why you went through whatever Calvin's men threw at you? Samuel's jaw tightened. Pruitt and another of Rusk's men blocked the creek crossing, tried to delay me with some nonsense about land disputes. Rebecca's blood went cold. He tried to stop you while Annie was... Didn't work, Samuel said firmly. I made it through. That's what matters. He used my daughter's fever as a weapon against you. The fury in Rebecca's voice surprised even herself. He would have let her die just to make a point about land. Calvin Rusk doesn't think in terms of children dying, thinks in terms of leverage and opportunity. Doesn't make it less monstrous, but it's not personal cruelty toward Annie. It's just a man who's forgotten that some things matter more than property lines. How do you stay so calm about it? Don't reckon I'm calm, Samuel said quietly. Reckon I'm just choosing what to focus my anger on. Anger I send toward Calvin doesn't help Annie's fever break. Anger I send toward fighting for this family, protecting what we're building here, that's anger worth keeping. Around 3 a.m, Annie's breathing changed. Rebecca noticed it first, the shift in rhythm, pulling her from the exhausted half-doze she'd fallen into despite her best efforts, and her whole body went rigid with fear before she registered what the change actually meant. The fever had broken. Annie's skin, which had burned hot for nearly 18 hours, was suddenly damp with sweat instead of dry with fever's cruel heat, her breathing settling into something deeper, more natural. Samuel, Rebecca's voice shook. Samuel, look. He was beside her, instantly pressing his hand to Annie's forehead, and the relief that broke across his face mirrored exactly what Rebecca felt crashing through her own chest. Fever's breaking, he said. Doc said this might happen, the body finally winning the fight. Rebecca began to cry, then the tears she'd held back for 18 straight hours finally breaking free. And Samuel didn't reach for her, didn't try to comfort her with words or touch, simply stayed close enough that she knew she wasn't alone in the relief. Why would you risk everything for a child who isn't even yours? Rebecca finally managed the question that had been building in her since the moment he'd ridden off hours before. Samuel's eyes stayed on Annie's now peaceful face. Because I know what it is to watch a fever take someone and be too small to stop it. This time I'm not too small. This time I had a horse fast enough and a doctor close enough, and I wasn't going to let anything, not Calvin Rusk, not his men, not the whole territory standing between me and that doctor's office, stop me from getting back here in time. She's not your blood. Don't matter. His voice was steady, certain. Blood's not what makes somebody yours, Rebecca. Choice is. And I chose this family the moment you stepped off that stagecoach and apologized for children who never needed apologizing for. Rebecca looked at him, then really looked, seeing past the exhaustion and dust and worry to the man underneath who had ridden through threats and danger for a child he'd known less than 3 weeks. I don't know how to thank you for tonight. Don't need thanking. Samuel finally allowed himself a small, tired smile. Just need her to keep getting better. That's payment enough. By the time the sun rose, Annie was sleeping peacefully, her fever fully broken color returning to cheeks that had been pale and drawn for nearly a full day. Dr. Hale arrived as promised and confirmed what Rebecca and Samuel already suspected: the worst had passed. She'll be tired for a few days, weak as kittens usually are after a fever like this, the doctor said, packing his bag. But she's a fighter, this one. Came through better than I expected, given how aggressive that fever was. Lily and Thomas, finally allowed to see their sister, crowded around her bed with the kind of relief only siblings understand, Thomas immediately launching into an excited recap of everything Annie had missed in her fevered sleep. Lily simply holding her sister's hand like she might disappear if released. Rebecca stood in the doorway watching this small reunion exhaustion, making her vision swim, and felt Samuel's presence beside her before he spoke. "Pruitt's gonna talk," he said quietly, eyes still on the children. "What happened on that trail? Calvin's gonna know his plan to delay me failed, gonna know I made it through despite his interference. What does that mean for us? Means he's gonna escalate. Man like Calvin doesn't take failure well, especially not failure that nearly cost a child her life and made him look the villain he actually is." Samuel's expression hardened. But it also means he's getting desperate. Desperate men make mistakes. Desperate men show their true colors to people who might have defended them before. You think this could work in our favor? I think Calvin Rusk just made a mistake he can't take back. Whole town's gonna hear eventually that his men blocked a man riding for a doctor for a dying child. Even folks who've believed his gossip up till now might start wondering what kind of man does that. Rebecca wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this terrible night might actually shift things in their favor, rather than simply marking the opening salvo of worse trouble to come. But as she watched Annie smile weakly at her siblings alive and recovering despite everything Calvin Rusk had thrown in their path, she felt something settle inside her that hadn't been there before. Not just gratitude for Samuel's courage, but something that looked suspiciously like the beginning of real trust. He had ridden into danger for a child who wasn't his blood. He had refused to turn back even when threatened. He had sat beside her through the longest night of fear, offering steady presence instead of empty platitudes. Whatever doubts still lingered about this arrangement, about whether kindness this consistent could possibly be real, Rebecca found those doubts growing quieter with every hour that proved Samuel Boone meant exactly what he said. That evening, with Annie sleeping soundly and the rest of the household finally settling into something resembling normal rhythm, again Lily approached Samuel on the porch where he sat mending tack by lantern light, the same patient work Rebecca had found him doing the night Calvin first threatened them at church. "Mr. Boone." He looked up. "Miss Lily, my father would have ridden for the doctor too." Her voice was quiet but steady, the words clearly costing her something to say. "He wasn't a coward. Whatever happened with the land, whatever he lost, he would have done what you did tonight." Samuel set down the leather strap he'd been working, giving the girl his full attention. I believe that. I know you're not him. I know you can't replace him. Lily's chin lifted the same proud gesture Rebecca recognized as her daughter's particular brand of courage. But you rode through whatever Calvin Rusk's men tried to do to you, and you didn't stop, and you brought the doctor in time to save my sister. Her voice cracked slightly. That matters. That's not nothing. No, Samuel said quietly. It's not nothing. Lily nodded once sharp, the gesture of someone closing a difficult conversation before emotion could overwhelm composure, and turned to head back inside. Lily. She stopped. Your father sounds like he was a good man, Samuel said. Raised a daughter brave enough to say what she just said to a stranger she's been guarding herself against for weeks. That's not small either. Something shifted in Lily's expression. Not quite a smile, but the loosening of muscles that had been tense for far too long. Good night, Mr. Boone. Good night, Miss Lily. She disappeared inside, and Samuel sat alone on the porch for a long while afterward, the night settling around him with all its weight and possibility. The conversation replaying in his mind, alongside the memory of Annie's fevered face, and the relief of watching her breathing settle into something safe. He didn't know yet that Calvin Rusk, humiliated by his men's failed interference and furious at the growing whispers of his cruelty spreading through town, was already drafting a new plan. One that wouldn't rely on intimidation or delay tactics, but on something far more dangerous to a man like Samuel Boone. Paperwork, old surveys, legal technicalities buried deep enough that even Samuel's lawyer might not catch them in time. Calvin Rusk had learned tonight that fear and threats wouldn't break Samuel Boone's resolve to protect his family. So he would try something else instead. Something that wouldn't touch the children directly, wouldn't risk the kind of public outrage that had already begun to turn the town's sympathy against him. He would simply take the land out from under all of them, and let Samuel Boone learn that some battles couldn't be won with courage alone. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier Rebecca didn't recognize, and the moment Samuel broke the seal and began reading, she watched the color drain from his face in a way that frightened her more than any fever ever could. What is it? Notice of claim. Samuel's voice had gone flat, the particular flatness of a man holding himself together by sheer will. Calvin's lawyer says the original survey of my property was conducted improperly. Says the creek boundary's been misrepresented for 30 years, ever since my grandfather first claimed this land. Can he do that? After all this time. Says he can. Says he's got a surveyor's report dated and notarized, claiming the creek access actually falls on his side of the line. Samuel set the letter down with hands that weren't quite steady. If it holds up, I lose the water rights. Maybe more than that. Maybe the house itself, depending on how far back they push the boundary. Rebecca felt the floor shift beneath her, the fragile stability they'd built over the past weeks suddenly fracturing under the weight of paperwork and lawyers and a man with enough money to manufacture whatever truth served him best. This is because of us, she said. Because Calvin couldn't break you with threats or gossip, so now he's trying to take everything legally. This is because Calvin Rusk has wanted this land for 2 years and finally found a lever he thinks might work. Samuel's jaw tightened. Don't blame yourself for his greed, Rebecca. He'd have found another excuse eventually, family or no family. But Rebecca couldn't shake the guilt clawing at her chest, the familiar terror that her presence, her children's presence, had become the catalyst for Samuel's potential ruin. Lily, who'd been listening from the staircase with the particular stillness she'd perfected since her father's death, finally spoke. What happens if he wins? Samuel looked at the girl, clearly weighing how much truth a 10-year-old could bear. Might lose the ranch. Might have to start over somewhere else. Would we still be a family if that happened? Lily's voice was steady, but Rebecca heard the fear underneath. Samuel's expression softened. Miss Lily, family's not about acreage. Whatever happens with this land, that doesn't change what's been building in this house these past weeks. But even as he said it, Rebecca saw the toll the threat was taking. The way his shoulders had tightened, the way his eyes kept drifting back to the letter, like it might rearrange itself into better news if he stared hard enough. The following days blurred into a desperate scramble for documentation for proof for anything that might counter Calvin's manufactured claim. Samuel rode into town daily, meeting with his lawyer, a tired man named Whitfield, who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by Calvin Rusk's resources compared to his own. The original deed's clear, Whitfield told them one evening, spreading papers across Samuel's kitchen table, while Rebecca poured coffee with hands that wouldn't quite settle. But Calvin's surveyor is claiming the creek shifted course sometime in the past decade, natural erosion changing the boundary lines. If the court believes that the original deed becomes irrelevant, the water rights would follow wherever the creek currently runs, not where it ran when your grandfather first claimed the land. That's absurd, Rebecca said. The creek hasn't moved. Doesn't matter what's true, ma'am. Matters what the court believes is true, and Calvin's got money enough to make a lot of people believe a lot of things. Whitfield's expression was grim. We need our own surveyor, our own evidence the creek stayed put. That costs money I don't think Samuel has lying around. Samuel's silence confirmed the lawyer's suspicion. How much? Rebecca asked. More than most ranchers see in a year's profit, Whitfield admitted. Calvin's banking on the cost alone, forcing Samuel to settle rather than fight. That night after Whitfield left and the children were finally asleep, Rebecca found Samuel in the barn, not working, simply sitting on an overturned bucket with his head in his hands, the posture of a man who'd been strong for everyone else for so long he'd forgotten how to be anything else. Samuel. He looked up, and the exhaustion in his face nearly broke her heart. Didn't mean for you to see this. See what a man who's allowed to be tired sometimes? She sat down on a hay bale across from him. You've been carrying all of this alone. The fever, Calvin's threats, now this lawsuit. You don't have to pretend you're not afraid. If I lose this land. His voice cracked the first crack Rebecca had heard since she'd met him. Everything my father built my grandfather before him, the only proof we were ever here. And if you do lose it, Samuel, what then? Then I start over. Somewhere else. With nothing but whatever savings Calvin's lawsuit doesn't eat up. He looked at her raw and honest in a way that stripped away every careful word he'd offered her since her arrival. And I don't know if a woman who's already lost everything once would want to risk losing it all again with a man who can't even hold on to his own family's legacy. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because she recognized in them the same fear that had haunted her since her husband's death. The fear of being too much trouble, too much risk, too much burden for anyone to choose voluntarily. Is that what you think? That I'd leave if you lost the land? Wouldn't blame you if you did. You came here for stability, for a man who could provide— I came here, Rebecca interrupted, her voice fierce, because your letters were the first kind words a stranger had offered me in over a year. I came here because you didn't flinch when I told you about 3 children instead of 1. I came here because some foolish, hopeful part of me believed you might actually mean what you said about wanting a family, not just a wife who came with minimal complications. She moved closer, kneeling in front of him, so their eyes were level. Samuel Boone, I have buried a husband. I have watched my own family turn their backs on me because grief made me inconvenient. I know exactly what it costs to lose everything and keep standing anyway. If this land is taken from you, it will not be the thing that breaks this family. The only thing that breaks us is if you decide we're not worth fighting for anymore. Samuel's breath caught something raw and overwhelmed moving across his face. You'd stay, even if I lost it all. I'd stay because of who you are, not because of what you own. Rebecca's hand found his gripping tight. You rode through Calvin's men to save my daughter. You mended a doll with stitches ugly enough to make a seamstress weep just to stop a 4-year-old from crying. You taught my son patience with horses and let my eldest daughter correct your carpentry without an ounce of wounded pride. None of that depends on acreage, Samuel. None of that disappears if Calvin wins his lawsuit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the barn settling into the particular silence that comes after truths too large for easy response. I love you. Samuel finally said the words, rough, unrehearsed, clearly surprising even himself with their arrival. Don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe the first night watching you kneel in the dust, refusing to apologize for loving your children too much. Maybe watching you fight that fever beside me, refusing to give up even when the night looked darkest. I love you, Rebecca Whitaker. And I love those 3 children, like they're my own blood. And I'll fight Calvin Rusk with everything I've got. But even if I lose, I need you to know, none of this changes what I feel. Rebecca's tears came without permission. The words landing somewhere deep and healing after months of believing herself unworthy of exactly this kind of declaration. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for longer than I've let myself admit. The kiss that followed was neither rushed nor desperate, but slow and certain, the kind of kiss that came from 2 people who'd weathered enough storms together to trust the calm finally settling between them. But peace, as Rebecca had learned repeatedly since arriving in Cedar Ridge, never lasted long in the shadow of Calvin Rusk's ambition. 3 days later, Whitfield arrived at the ranch with news that shifted everything. Found something, the lawyer said, spreading an old map across the kitchen table, his usual exhaustion replaced by something almost giddy. County Archive had records I hadn't thought to check, original survey notes from when your grandfather first filed the claim, Samuel, hand-drawn but detailed enough to show the creek's exact position 40 years ago. Samuel leaned over the map, his expression sharpening with cautious hope. And creek hasn't moved an inch. Whoever drew up Calvin's manufactured survey either lied outright or used measurements from a completely different stretch of water. Whitfield's finger traced the original boundary lines. This is solid evidence, Samuel. Combined with testimony from old-timers who've lived here since before Calvin Rusk ever arrived in this territory, we might actually have a case strong enough to beat him. Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, began to take root in the kitchen. What do we need to do? Rebecca asked. Court date's set for next week. We present this evidence, bring in witnesses who remember the original boundary, and pray the judge isn't already bought and paid for by Calvin's money. Whitfield's expression sobered slightly. I won't lie to you both. Calvin's got influence in this territory that money built over years. Even solid evidence sometimes loses against that kind of pressure. Then we make sure the whole town hears the truth before that courtroom date. Samuel said something fierce, settling into his expression. Calvin spent weeks spreading poison about my family. Time we let folks hear what actually happened, the fever, his men blocking the trail, the lies in his survey. The week that followed became a blur of preparation. Samuel and Rebecca working alongside Whitfield to gather testimony, organize evidence, and slowly, carefully shift the narrative that had dominated Cedar Ridge gossip since Rebecca's arrival. Mrs. Caldwell surprisingly became an unexpected ally. Her conscience apparently troubled enough by Calvin's manipulation that she began quietly correcting the gossip in her store, telling customers the truth about Samuel's desperate ride for the doctor, about Pruitt, and Calvin's men blocking a dying child's path to medical help. Man tried to use a sick baby's fever as leverage. Mrs. Caldwell told one customer within Rebecca's hearing, her voice carrying the particular outrage of someone who'd finally recognized she'd been deceived. That's not the action of a concerned neighbor. That's the action of a man with no conscience left. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to shift. But Calvin Rusk wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and as the court date approached, his desperation manifested in increasingly reckless moves. It started with the cattle. Rebecca woke one morning to Thomas's frantic shouting from outside, and by the time she reached the window, she could see Samuel already running toward the corral where several of his cattle had somehow escaped through a fence that had been perfectly intact the evening before. Someone cut the wire, Samuel announced, grimly examining the damage an hour later, after most of the cattle had been rounded up and the immediate crisis contained. Clean cuts, not weather damage or animal pressure. Someone wanted these cattle loose. Calvin, Rebecca said, not a question. Can't prove it. But the timing's awful convenient, less than a week before the court date that could cost him everything he's been fighting for. 2 days later, it was the well. Samuel discovered the contamination when the water came up cloudy, tasting faintly of something chemical that no natural source should have produced. Dr. Hale, called out to examine the water, confirmed Rebecca's worst fears. Someone's poisoned this well, he said grimly. Not enough to kill, but enough to make a body sick if they drank it regular. Lucky you caught it before the children. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face, imagining Annie or Thomas drinking contaminated water, the fever that had nearly taken her daughter, once now potentially compounded by deliberate poisoning. "This has gone too far," Rebecca said that night, fury and fear warring in her chest. "Cattle now the well, Samuel, he's escalating towards something worse. What if next time it's not the well? What if next time it's the children themselves?" Samuel's expression had gone hard dangerous in a way Rebecca hadn't seen before. "Then I stop being patient and start being something Calvin Rusk should be more afraid of." "What does that mean?" "Means I ride into town tomorrow and have a conversation with Calvin that doesn't involve lawyers or courtrooms." "Samuel, no. If you confront him directly, give him any excuse to claim you threatened him, you could lose everything before the court date even arrives." He knew she was right, the fury visibly warring with reason in his expression, but finally he nodded, accepting the wisdom even as it clearly cost him to swallow his anger. "Then we protect what we can protect," he said. "Keep the children close, keep watch through the nights, survive until that court date, and let the law handle what my fists are itching to handle myself." The court date arrived on a sweltering morning that felt appropriately oppressive, given the stakes hanging over the proceedings. Rebecca dressed the children carefully, explained as gently as possible what was happening, and tried not to let her own terror show, as they all settled into the small courtroom alongside Samuel and Whitfield. Calvin Rusk arrived, with his own lawyer expensive and confident, the kind of man whose very presence suggested he'd never lost a case, he'd been paid enough to win. The proceedings began with Calvin's surveyor presenting his manufactured evidence, claiming with practiced authority that natural erosion had shifted the creek's course over decades, moving the water rights firmly onto Rusk property. Rebecca watched Samuel's jaw clench through the testimony. Watched Whitfield take careful notes, preparing his counter. When their turn came, Whitfield presented the original survey map with quiet confidence, walking the judge through 40 years of unchanged boundary lines, supported by testimony from 3 elderly residents who'd lived in Cedar Ridge since before Calvin Rusk had ever set foot in the territory. "I remember that creek the day Samuel's grandfather first staked his claim. One old-timer testified, his voice creaking with age, but certain in its conviction. Hasn't moved a foot in 40 years. Mr. Rusk's surveyor either can't read a map proper or he's lying for money." The courtroom murmured, and Rebecca felt the first genuine flicker of hope since the lawsuit began. But Calvin's lawyer wasn't finished. He pivoted, shifting strategy with the kind of practiced ease that suggested he'd anticipated this exact counter. "Your Honor, regardless of historical boundary lines, I'd like to introduce additional testimony regarding Mr. Boone's character and judgment, relevant to whether he's truly fit to maintain rights over disputed property." Rebecca's stomach dropped. She glanced at Samuel, whose expression had gone carefully blank in the way she now recognized as him, bracing for an attack. "Mr. Boone recently took in a widow and her 3 children," the lawyer continued. "Despite limited resources and an already precarious financial situation, regarding this very land dispute, one might question the judgment of a man who takes on significant new financial burden in the middle of contested legal proceedings. Perhaps suggesting instability, recklessness, even that calls into question his fitness to maintain rights over valuable water access." The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable, painting Rebecca and her children as evidence against Samuel rather than the family worth protecting that they actually were. Rebecca felt Lily's hand grip her sleeve tight, felt Thomas press closer against her side, and the old familiar shame began creeping up her spine, the terror that her presence had become exactly the liability everyone had warned her she would be. But before Whitfield could object, before Samuel could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the courtroom's tension. "Your Honor, if I might address that claim directly." Mrs. Caldwell stood from the gallery, her expression set with the particular determination of a woman who'd decided enough was enough. "I run the dry goods store in Cedar Ridge," she said, voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "I've watched Mrs. Whitaker and her children since their arrival. I've watched Samuel Boone's character through every interaction he's had with this family. Her eyes flicked toward Calvin sharp, with newfound conviction. 3 weeks ago, that little girl nearly died of fever. Samuel rode for the doctor himself, and Mr. Rusk's own men blocked his path on the trail, delayed a man trying to save a dying child's life over some dispute about water rights. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, Calvin's face flushing red with fury and panic in equal measure. "That's hearsay," his lawyer began. "It's not hearsay, it's witness testimony," Whitfield interjected smoothly. "Dr. Hale can confirm the timeline of his summons that night, and we have testimony from townsfolk who heard Mr. Rusk's own employees boasting about the delay tactic afterward. Dr. Hale called forward, confirmed every detail, the desperate ride, the delayed arrival, the fever that had nearly claimed Annie's life while Samuel fought through obstacles Calvin's own men had erected." The judge's expression had shifted from neutral attention to something considerably colder as he looked toward Calvin Rusk. "Mr. Rusk, are you aware your employees attempted to delay medical care for a sick child as part of this property dispute?" Calvin's composure cracked for the first time, his expensive lawyer clearly unprepared for this turn of testimony. "Your Honor, I have no knowledge of—" "He knew," Samuel said, standing despite Whitfield's restraining hand on his arm. "Pruitt told me himself. Your Honor, that Mr. Rusk wanted a word about the creek crossing, used my daughter's medical emergency as leverage to delay me. There are witnesses who heard the exchange." The courtroom had gone fully silent now, every eye fixed on Calvin Rusk, whose carefully constructed image as a concerned neighbor was crumbling in real time. The judge's gavel cracked against his desk. "I've heard enough. The original survey evidence clearly establishes the boundary lines as historically unchanged. Furthermore, testimony regarding deliberate interference with medical emergency response calls into serious question the integrity of the plaintiff's entire case and character." Calvin's face had gone white, then red, his lawyer whispering urgently beside him. "This court rules in favor of the defendant, Samuel Boone. Water rights and disputed boundary remain as established by original survey and 40 years of unchallenged use." Furthermore, the judge's voice hardened further. "Given testimony regarding interference with emergency medical care, I'm referring this matter to the county attorney for potential criminal investigation into endangerment." The courtroom erupted. Calvin Rusk's protests drowned beneath the murmur of a town finally hearing the truth, finally understanding exactly what kind of man had been manipulating their gossip and their sympathies for weeks. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face, relief crashing through her chest so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. Lily gripped her hand tight. Thomas's face split into a wide grin. Annie, too young to fully understand the legal victory, but old enough to sense the relief in the room, clapped her small hands together in delight. Samuel turned to Rebecca, his own eyes bright with unshed tears, the weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty finally lifting from his shoulders. "We won," he said, voice thick with disbelief and gratitude. "Rebecca, we actually won." "You won," she corrected, pulling him close despite the public setting, despite the eyes of the entire courtroom watching their embrace. "You fought for this family with everything you had, and it mattered. It actually mattered." Outside the courthouse, as the family made their way toward the wagon, Lily paused. Looking back at where Calvin Rusk stood, being escorted out by his own lawyer, his face still flushed with humiliation and fury. "He's not going to stop, is he?" she asked quietly. "Men like that don't just give up." Samuel followed her gaze, and something settled in his expression. Not worry, but a kind of fierce certainty that hadn't been there before today's victory. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But he's lost his legal weapon, lost the town's sympathy, and likely facing criminal charges for what he did to Annie. Whatever he tries next, he's trying it from a position of weakness, not strength." That evening, with the immediate crisis resolved, and the household finally settling into something resembling genuine peace, Rebecca found herself standing on the porch beside Samuel, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that felt symbolically appropriate for the day's victory. "I want to ask you something," Samuel said, turning to face her fully. "Not because of today, not because we won, and emotions are running high. Been wanting to ask for over a week now, just kept waiting for the right moment." Rebecca's heart began to race. "Samuel." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small ring, simple, clearly handmade, rather than purchase the kind of ring a man might fashion himself with patient hours and careful hands. "Made this myself," he said, slightly self-conscious. "Ain't fancy. Ain't what a woman like you probably deserves. But I wanted something that came from my own hands, same as the doll stitches, same as everything else I've tried to give this family since you arrived. Samuel, Rebecca Whitaker, I love you. Love your children like my own blood have since before I'd admit it even to myself. I'm not asking because of practicality or convenience or any of the reasons that brought you here in the first place. I'm asking because I can't imagine this house, this life, without you and Lily and Thomas and Annie, filling every room with the kind of noise I always wanted but never thought I'd earn." His voice roughened. "Will you marry me properly with the whole town watching? No more secret arrangements or practical letters. Just two people choosing each other and the family we've already built." Rebecca's tears came freely now, joy and relief and months of accumulated grief finally finding release in this single perfect moment. "Yes," she said, voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Samuel Boone. I'll marry you." Inside through the window, Rebecca could see Lily watching the exchange with an expression that had finally fully softened into something like hope. Thomas pressed his face against the glass, grinning, despite clearly not understanding the full significance of what he was witnessing. Annie, still recovering her full strength, but bright-eyed and curious, asked Lily what was happening outside. "I think," Lily said softly, "Mama's finally found someone who won't leave." But even as the family celebrated this hard-won victory, even as Samuel slid the handmade ring onto Rebecca's finger and sealed their engagement with a kiss that promised every tomorrow neither of them had dared hope for, Calvin Rusk sat alone in his finer house on the finer side of town, humiliation and fury curdling into something far more dangerous than legal maneuvering. He had lost the land, lost the town's sympathy, possibly faced criminal charges that could end whatever respectability he'd built over years of careful manipulation. But Calvin Rusk wasn't a man who accepted defeat, not truly, not when one final card remained to be played, a card that wouldn't involve lawyers or surveys or anything the court could rule against. The wedding would be public. The whole town would attend. And Calvin Rusk intended to make absolutely certain that everyone present remembered exactly what kind of woman Samuel Boone was choosing to marry, even if it meant burning the last of his reputation to do it. The wedding was set for the following Sunday, and the week leading up to it passed in a blur of preparation that almost let Rebecca forget the danger still circling them. Almost. "He's been quiet," Samuel said one evening, mending his good shirt with the same clumsy stitches he'd once used on Annie's doll. "Too quiet. Calvin Rusk doesn't go quiet unless he's planning something." "Maybe he's accepted defeat," Rebecca said, though she didn't believe it herself. "Men like Calvin don't accept defeat. They regroup." Whitfield arrived 2 days before the wedding with news that confirmed Samuel's suspicions. County attorneys moving forward with charges against Calvin for the endangerment claim. Word is he's furious, says he's got nothing left to lose now. "What does that mean for the wedding?" Rebecca asked, fear tightening her chest. "Means a desperate man with nothing left to lose is unpredictable," Whitfield said grimly. "Might want to consider extra precautions for Sunday." Samuel's jaw set hard. "Wedding happens as planned. I won't let that man dictate one more day of our lives." But Rebecca noticed the way he checked the rifle by the door more often that week, the way he walked the property line twice each evening, instead of once, the way his eyes lingered on the children a beat longer whenever they wandered out of immediate sight. Lily noticed too. "You're worried he'll do something at the wedding?" It wasn't a question, and Samuel didn't bother denying it. "Want you to stay close to your mother that day, Miss Lily. You and Thomas both. Keep an eye on Annie." "You think he'd hurt us in front of the whole town?" "Don't know what a desperate man's capable of," Samuel admitted. "Just want my family safe whatever happens." Sunday arrived with a sky so clear and blue it seemed almost mockingly perfect for a day shadowed by such uncertainty. Rebecca dressed in a simple gown, nothing fancy. Nothing that pretended this was anything other than what it was, Two people choosing each other despite everything stacked against them. "You look beautiful, Mama," Lily said, helping fasten the last button at Rebecca's collar. "Thank you, baby." "Are you scared?" Rebecca met her daughter's eyes in the mirror. "A little, but not enough to stop me from walking down that aisle." The small chapel filled faster than Rebecca expected, the whole town turning out, some from genuine support after the courtroom revelations, others from simple curiosity about how the day might unfold given Calvin Rusk's public humiliation weeks before. Rebecca scanned the crowd as she walked toward Samuel, searching despite herself for Calvin's face among the gathered townspeople. She found him near the back, dressed impeccably, as always, his expression unreadable in a way that made her stomach clench with dread. Samuel stood at the front watching her approach, and whatever fear lived in his chest about Calvin's presence seemed to dissolve the moment their eyes met, replaced by something so openly adoring that Rebecca felt tears threatening before she'd even reached him. The ceremony began smoothly, the minister's words carrying the weight of genuine blessing rather than mere formality. And for several minutes, Rebecca allowed herself to simply exist in the moment, surrounded by her children, marrying a man who had proven beyond any doubt that he chose this family freely, completely. Then Calvin Rusk stood. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carrying easily through the small chapel. "But I find myself unable to stay silent while this town celebrates a marriage built on such poor judgment." The minister paused clearly, uncertain how to proceed. Whispers rippled through the gathered crowd. "Calvin." Samuel said, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't the place." "Isn't it?" Calvin stepped into the aisle, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the desperation underneath. "You're about to bind yourself legally to a woman with 3 children that aren't yours, 3 mouths to feed for the rest of your natural life, all while your land sits encumbered by legal proceedings. I intend to appeal." "The appeal's already been denied," Whitfield called from his seat. "Judge ruled definitively, Calvin. You know that." "I know the system can be persuaded." Calvin said, his eyes glittering with something that looked almost unhinged. "Money has a way of changing outcomes given enough time and patience." Rebecca felt Lily's hand find hers, from where the children sat in the front pew, gripping tight with the particular fear of a child who'd learned exactly how dangerous desperate men could be. "Samuel Boone is marrying another man's leftovers." Calvin continued, his voice rising ugly and cruel in a way that finally revealed the true face he'd hidden beneath careful manipulation for weeks. "A widow too proud to admit her children are a burden no sensible man should bear. He's throwing away his family's legacy on charity, dressed up as romance." The chapel erupted into murmurs, some scandalized, others simply uncomfortable witnessing such a public unraveling. Samuel's hands curled into fists at his sides, and Rebecca watched the visible effort it took him to control the fury clearly building in his chest. "You don't get to stand in my wedding and insult my family," Samuel said, his voice carrying clear and steady despite the rage simmering beneath. "Your family?" Calvin laughed, sharp and bitter. "She's not even truly yours, Boone. Just a desperate woman who needed rescuing, and a man too soft-hearted to recognize charity when it's wearing a wedding dress." Rebecca felt the old shame trying to claw its way back up the familiar voice, whispering that Calvin was right, that she'd always be too much, too burdensome, too complicated for genuine love, rather than pity dressed up as romance. But then she looked at Samuel. He turned, fully facing Calvin now, and something in his expression had shifted from controlled fury into something far more powerful, absolute, unshakable certainty. "No," Samuel said, his voice carrying through the entire chapel with the kind of authority that demanded attention. "I'm marrying the bravest woman in Montana territory. A woman who crossed 1,000 miles on nothing but hope and desperate courage, who knelt in the dust apologizing for children who never deserved a single moment of shame, who fought a fever through the longest night of her life without once considering giving up." He turned to face the gathered crowd, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And those children aren't leftovers, Calvin Rusk. They're not burdens or charity cases or mistakes to be tolerated. Lily corrects my carpentry because her father taught her to be sharp and capable, and I respect every word of correction she's ever given me. Thomas asks 100 questions a day, because his mind never stops working, and I intend to answer every single one for the rest of my life. Annie hums while she plays, despite everything she's lost. And that doll I mended with these clumsy hands means more to me than every acre of land you've spent 2 years trying to steal. Calvin's face had gone red, his composure fully shattered now. They are mine, Samuel continued, because I choose them. Every single day I choose them. Not out of pity, not out of charity, but because loving them is the easiest thing I've done since the day they arrived in my life. You want to call that foolishness, Calvin? You want to stand here and mock a love you've never once experienced because you've spent your whole life chasing land and money instead of anything worth actually keeping? The chapel had gone utterly silent, every eye fixed on Samuel, on the raw conviction blazing in his expression. I feel sorry for you. Samuel said, his voice dropping into something almost gentle despite the steel underneath. You've got more money than half this town combined, and you've never once experienced what it feels like to have a 4-year-old fall asleep against your shoulder trusting you completely. You've never watched a 10-year-old slowly learn to trust again after losing her father. You've never felt the particular joy of a 7-year-old asking you 100 questions because he believes you'll always have an answer worth hearing. Calvin opened his mouth, but nothing emerged, his usual confidence completely deserting him under the weight of Samuel's unflinching honesty. This wedding isn't charity, Samuel finished. It's the best decision I've ever made. Now either sit down and witness it properly, or leave my wedding the same way you've tried to leave my family empty-handed, and finally understanding exactly what you've lost by choosing greed over everything that actually matters. For a long suspended moment, Calvin Rusk stood frozen in the aisle, his entire carefully constructed world crumbling in real time before an audience that had finally seen him clearly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the chapel, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence he left behind. The door closed. The silence stretched. Then someone in the back began to clap. It spread through the chapel like wildfire, the whole town rising to their feet, applauding not just the conclusion of Calvin's humiliating exit, but the truth Samuel had spoken so fiercely, so completely in defense of the family he'd chosen. Rebecca, tears streaming freely, now looked at Samuel with a love so overwhelming it nearly buckled her knees. "Marry me," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Right now, before anything else can possibly interrupt us." Samuel's answering smile was the brightest she'd seen from him yet. "Already planning on it, Mrs. Boone." The minister, recovering his composure, cleared his throat and continued the ceremony, with renewed warmth, the earlier tension completely transformed into something closer to celebration. When Samuel finally kissed his bride, the chapel erupted into applause once more. Thomas whooping loudly enough to draw laughter from the gathered crowd, Lily wiping unexpected tears from her own eyes, Annie clapping her small hands together in pure, uncomplicated joy. The reception afterward, held at the ranch under a sky beginning its slow transition toward sunset, felt like a celebration, not just of marriage, but of survival, of a family that had weathered threats and fevers and courtroom battles and emerged stronger for every trial endured. Mrs. Caldwell approached Rebecca during the festivities, her expression carrying genuine warmth that had been absent during their first uncomfortable meeting weeks before. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for repeating Calvin's poison without questioning it properly. You and your children deserved better than the welcome this town gave you." "You spoke the truth in that courtroom," Rebecca said. "That matters more than any earlier mistake." "Your husband's a good man," Mrs. Caldwell continued. "Whole town can see that clearly now after everything that's happened." Rebecca watched Samuel across the yard, crouched down to Thomas's level, both of them laughing at something the boy had said, and felt her heart swell with a happiness she genuinely believed herself unworthy of just months before. "He is," she agreed simply. As the evening deepened, the children's energy finally beginning to flag after the day's excitement, Rebecca found a quiet moment alone with Samuel, near the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Lily called you Pa today," she said softly. Did you notice? Samuel's breath caught. Thought I imagined it. You didn't imagine it. She said it during the reception, asking if Pa wanted more cake. Rebecca smiled at his clearly overwhelmed expression. I think that's the first time she's used that word since her father died. That's the greatest gift anyone's given me today, Samuel said, voice rough with emotion. And that's saying something considering I married the woman I love this morning. Months passed, the seasons shifting from summer's brutal heat into autumn's gentler colors, and the Boone Ranch transformed from a house that had known too much silence into a home filled with the particular noise of genuine family. Thomas had become nearly fluent in horse care, Samuel's patient teaching paying dividends in a boy who'd found his calling early. Lily had taken to calling Samuel Pa with increasing regularity, the word no longer surprising either of them, but simply true earned through months of consistent presence and unwavering kindness. Annie still carried her doll everywhere. The clumsy stitches Samuel had sewn months before, now slightly faded, but still holding strong, a physical reminder of the night love had first proven itself through imperfect, devoted action. Calvin Rusk had left Cedar Ridge entirely within weeks of the wedding, his criminal charges and ruined reputation making the territory inhospitable for a man who'd built his entire identity around manipulation and control. Word eventually reached town that he'd settled somewhere further west, though nobody much cared to track his fate beyond simple curiosity. On a quiet evening in early October, Rebecca stood on the porch watching the sunset, listening to the sounds of laughter drifting from inside the house. Thomas recounting some adventure with the horses. Lily's softer voice occasionally interjecting corrections. Annie's high, delighted giggle punctuating the conversation. Samuel joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and together they watched the last light fade from the Montana sky. Regret anything? He asked quietly. About coming here. About everything we've been through. Rebecca leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of a man who'd proven himself worthy of every ounce of trust she'd slowly learned to offer. Not for a single moment, she said. I spent so long believing I was too many children, too much grief, too much burden for anyone to choose freely. You taught me that love isn't measured in convenience or simplicity. It's measured in choice, repeated every single day, regardless of difficulty. Best choice I ever made, Samuel said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Inside, the laughter continued, the house finally filled with exactly the noise Samuel had once confessed to building it for years, before he'd known Rebecca Whitaker or her 3 remarkable children existed. The house had not saved them, not truly. They had saved the house, filled its empty rooms with exactly the kind of love and noise and chaos it had been waiting decades to hold. And as autumn deepened into the kind of evening that promised a long, peaceful winter ahead, Rebecca Whitaker Boone understood with absolute certainty that she would never again feel like too much for anyone willing to truly see her. She had found a man who chose her completely, children, who'd found a father worth trusting, and a home built not on convenience or desperation, but on the kind of love that withstood every storm thrown against it, and emerged every single time stronger than before. Some families are born. This one had been chosen, fought for, and earned through fire, and nothing Calvin Rusk or anyone else could ever do would take that away from them again.